Good evening. I'm Isaac Benesver, host, co-producer of Conversations. We're going into our 13th year, and I'm with Jay Levy. Jay Levy is not only a resident of Amherst, but a resident of the world because he's been involved with working with the homeless population ever since he graduated from Columbia University in the 80s. Jay, welcome to Conversations.
Pleasure to be here, Isaac.
We sort of bridge two different generations. In my time, the song was, "Buddy, can you spare a dime?" And Jay was telling me that he had dollars in his pocket when he saw unemployed while he was going to school, and that kind of gave him some incentive to think about maybe this is where I ought to make my career. So tell us about that, Jay. How'd you get started?
Well, I started out in the 1980s. I was a new graduate from Columbia University, lived in Brooklyn, and homelessness was really on my doorstep. So it was a time in the 80s when the number of people who were out there and in need was expanding at an incredible rate. And you would see people who were obviously having a number of difficulties, whether it was mental illness. You saw people talking to themselves, or people who looked like they had been outside for a long period of time. You saw people who were often, brown bagging it, drinking on the corners. And as you took the subways, there was always someone in the subway asking for money. So my experience on a day-to-day basis was to bump into these folks and to have to make that decision. What do? Do you give some money? Do you talk with the person? Do you get to know them? And in the beginning, I would just give a little bit of money and walk away. And over time, I became dissatisfied with that kind of approach. I really wanted to learn about people and see where they were at. And since I was going to social work school, I thought it was a great opportunity to go into doing homeless outreach. And so I looked into that and began working with the Manhattan Bowery Corporation, which the Bowery was the place where they used to talk about it in a very negative term about the Bowery bum. And this goes back to the 1960s and the flop houses and the detox, and they would do the outreach and get people in these places to get some help. But then as homelessness picked up and there was greater numbers on the streets, we began doing outreach across the city of Manhattan. And I used to go to places like Central Park and to the Port Authority. And in my book, Homeless Narratives and Pretreatment Pathways, I kind of talk about that journey and the experiences of all the people I met, whether it was out in New York City, whether it was in Boston, or in the woods of western Massachusetts.
And we're talking about the book he wrote, if I can get the camera to focus on this, Homeless Narratives and Pretreatment Pathways. Now, just a comment on, I have read the book, and one of the things that impressed me as a retired social worker was a recognition that that the unemployed population goes from the family that gets dispossessed, foreclosed, sheriff saled, to the individual who's a veteran of today from past wars like World War II, Vietnam, Korea, who's out in the street with chronic problems of alcohol and mental illness. What's exciting about this as somebody who's worked with the unemployed population and homeless shelters is that it understood the importance of creating a safe place. In other words, housing as a prevention or as a first step to future health care and treatment. Too many of the services focus the other way around.
That's right.
They want people to come in for treatment before they'll consider the biggest issue that these people have, most of these people have, and that's safety. Having a roof over their head, not sleeping under bridges. You want to pick up on that?
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. I think for a long time, the approach toward helping people was to put treatment first. And what that meant is if you had someone who was not ready for a variety of reasons to step forward and say, hey, I have a mental illness, and I need help. Or if someone maybe who had an addiction wasn't willing to say that they had an addiction and needed help and began showing up to go to groups or to take medications or whatever it is, then they were turned away. And they would turn out to be the folks that year after year would remain homeless and would remain in need. And so in the book, I talk about this as kind of my journey, again, whether it was in New York City or the woods of Western Mass or Boston. I would meet these people that were homeless 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, out there on the streets, to a large extent because of this barrier, because of this treatment-oriented system toward trying to help people. And these were good people and very vulnerable people, folks who were at risk that really could end up on death's doorstep or be injured in some kind of major way. Some of the folks were veterans, as you alluded to. 15%, 13 to 15% of the homeless individuals are veterans, people that have served the country. And so putting the housing first, that's been the great change that's been occurring really over the last 5 to 10 years, but more significantly in the last 3 or 4 years. And in Massachusetts, we've really started a number of what we call housing first programs, and that is putting affordable housing first, but matching it with a very good support service. And what I really like to say about all of this, because when I think of things, I think of the outreach approach toward helping. It's what I've done for so many years. No matter what you do and no matter what you call it, it all really starts with relationships. Developing trust with someone, letting someone know that when they meet with you, it's a safe place where they can kind of share their difficulties, their goals, their dreams, and that you're kind of cueing into where they're at. You start where the client is at, as we say, and from there you can offer very quickly, hopefully, affordable housing, and from there kind of go on a journey with the individual toward trying to figure out, well, how are you going to be able to pay your rent each month if that comes up as a need? Or how can you better get along with neighbors? Or how can you take care of the property? These are the natural challenges that we all have when we're housed. And you jump off that towards some of the treatment concerns that the person might be experiencing.
Give us a couple of examples. I know in the book you talk about several very, very homeless folks who had a way of life which they fell into, and you learned very quickly from the conversations you had that you had to go where they were in order to open the door to starting a relationship, to be able to help them ultimately to get out, get off the street. That took time. Want to give us an example?
Sure, and there's lots of examples I can draw off of. There was a gentleman named Andrew who I worked with many years ago, probably about 6 years ago or so at this point.
Is that the Port Authority?
Nope, he lived at a shelter in Boston, and he was someone who would basically say when I first met him, leave me alone, I'm not playing the game. And he really viewed, when people are homeless, and they're homeless for many years, there's a way that they come to understand the world that they live in. That, of course, includes their homeless condition. So he was an African-American male in his 40s at the time. And his understanding is he saw himself as being very oppressed by white society, and he blamed, people in that white power structure for putting him into the position that he was in. He had a long story of trauma, that he used to have a job where he worked for the Transit Authority. And it turned out that one day when he showed up at the shelter, they told him, and he was already homeless at this point, and he was trying to hold on to his job at the Transit Authority. There was a fire that occurred prior to that made him initially homeless. They told him he had to be in by a certain hour, and the hour that he had to check in at the shelter didn't match with the hours that he was working at the Transit Authority. And that led to him getting very angry and having an outburst, and this led to, you know, the police being called in and kind of the authorities coming down on him. And so he saw, you know, the meaning kind of in his world was around him dealing with this oppression, and the way he decided to deal with it was to say, I no longer play the game. If I see $1 on the street, he would say, do you think I'm going to pick it up? He goes, no, that's what they want me to do. They want me subservient, and I'm not going to do that. And when I initially approached him, being someone who was white, he didn't want to talk to me. That's the way he would sort of cast me aside, say, look, I'm not playing the game. I know what you represent. So I had to really begin where he was at and to be very patient and to take my time, do outreach kind of in the general area, get to know other people, show them that I was working with other people who were African American, you know, moving people out into housing, and knowing that he could kind of witness that or get wind of it through the homeless network at the shelter, offer need items. You know, these are all ways of engaging with someone initially and building trust. You know, you think if you go to, I don't know, someone's house, you might bring them some pastry, right? You're going into their home and you're saying, here's a gift, thanks for connecting with me today. And we do the same thing, you know, when working on the streets. It might be a pair of socks, it might be some food, it might be some underwear, whatever someone might need to get by. And as I began to form a relationship with this guy, the other thing he would tell me is, look, I've been mentally murdered. He didn't see himself as mentally ill, but he saw himself as someone who had gone through a horrific trauma. He had been homeless at this point 18 years when I met him at the shelter. I mean, these stories are incredible in terms of the length of time some folks have been out there and really forgotten about in our society. And the longer I got to know him, we were able to frame things out in terms of the trauma that he saw in his world. There was a bridging that took place. I call it bridging of language, from understanding a person's world and his trauma of being mentally murdered to mental health concerns around stress, around how that impacts the way he functions. He was to the point where the way he had lost his work at the transit authority made him feel like he could never take another bus. He could never take the subway. It just reminded him of too many negative things. If he would go on a job interview and try to get new work, and he'd be talking to someone, and somebody would pick up a pen, like I'm picking up here, and to write, if he would see the point of the pen in his direction, he felt he was being threatened by the person who was interviewing him. So there was actually some significant paranoid ideation, along with some cultural concerns and a real sense of being oppressed, which had a reality basis to it as well. But it was a mix of all these things. And I needed to understand his world and to bridge that to the idea of maybe he could qualify for some benefits, because the trauma he went through, the mental murder that he talks about, puts him in a position where he doesn't trust people anymore. And it's hard for him to go through an interview. It's hard for him to get a job and to maintain a job. And so he was able to make that connection eventually and trust me to work with him, which took many months. And we were able to get him benefits and eventually even tie him to the Department of Mental Health for counseling and all sorts of other things. And that's the short version of a long story where today, with Housing First, I could have approached this guy and much more quickly say, well, you know, I have some affordable housing that I'm connected to. And when you get to the point where you're comfortable enough with me and you let me know, I'd be more than happy to walk over there with you and show it to you. And then we could start our journey from there. And that's very powerful. But we didn't have those kinds of tools back a few years back when I was doing that kind of work. But that's a good example of some of the many stories that are in the book.
So you're directing this book, Homeless Narratives, not only to new social workers, but also social workers, as well as people in the community who want to have some kind of an understanding of the complications, what it takes to work with populations that are at high risk.
Yes, I think.
Are you getting any comments?
Oh, lots of comments. You know, the book tells the stories, which are stories of survival and stories of meaning making. And each person I can talk about in the book, each character, you know, which is someone who I've really met and worked with, has their way of adapting and making meaning. You know, with Andrew, it was the idea of the oppression. He also saw himself as a researcher. He was researching, in his view, in his mind's eye, time travel. And so his place to stay in my work with him was also connected to as a place where he could further his studies. He enjoyed talking about Einstein. I mean, he was a very smart guy. Another story in the book, Old Man Ray, who I talk about, you know, he was someone who saw himself, he was living so many years at the Port Authority, a guy in his 60s, he was a veteran, served in World War II at the time, because I had met him in the 1980s. He saw himself as the night watchman of the Port Authority. And his view is he was there to help me, to give me information. He didn't want my help initially. He was too proud for that. After all, I was this young social worker coming out of school. He was the wise elder, and I had to respect that. So as you work with people, it's very interesting to connect to the kind of the cultural differences or the age differences and how that mixes in with different, you know, disabilities or issues or addictions or whatever it is. Old Man Ray was a drinker. He would take nips. You know, there were some other reasons why he was out there, but a big part of it was also just poverty and being an elder and not having a support system and not having access to affordable housing. So every story, I think, says a little something in a micro way about the human condition and how to help people. And whether it's helping the homeless or helping an elder that you know in your family or helping a youth that's kind of disaffiliated or disconnected, it still comes down to how do we build relationships? How do we develop trust? How do we let people know that we understand their world? And how do we bridge their world to these other opportunities to be helped? And a lot of it is learning to talk a language, the language of the person that you're meeting and connecting with, but also the language of the places that offer help, and to show how these things can come together and exist together and make it really available to the person. So, you know, if I try to get someone Social Security, you show up at a Social Security place or at Department of Transitional Assistance, welfare, and you're trying to get money, you have to be trying to get money for a disability. So all of a sudden you have to talk the language of disability to get the money. Well, how many people do we meet and try to help and they don't see themselves as having a disability, even if they're presenting with significant mental illness, they still may see themselves as not having a problem. You meet someone who's very paranoid, they don't say, I'm paranoid. They think the problem is with everyone else. So those are the kind of challenges we're up against.
You know, earlier, before we went on air, we talked about the recent experience of the storm and how that was, for some people, an opportunity to begin to realize that suddenly doing without heat, suddenly doing without food for a period of time, not having access to communication, not having access to other people, presented all kinds of challenges, and some did very well, and the best of people came out during that period of time, but there also were casualties. So in a sense, those of us who experienced loss of power for several days and no heat, and what came with that, got a very small taste of some element of what it means to be homeless, and to be without things that are really essential. Did you have an opportunity to talk to anybody about this?
Well, I did. I mean, I went through the power outage myself for 4.5 days, and it was very trying with my family and the basement filling up with water and all the challenges that we suddenly had. And out in the world where I do my work, part of what was happening is some people in some communities were ending up in shelters because they didn't have access to heat. And some people were quite frail. A lot of the elderly needed help, or maybe didn't have support systems, or some others. And in fact, in Northampton, one of the shelters, Grove Street Inn, didn't have power and had to shut down. And they were moved to one of the schools that had power. And they were mixed in with some of the population in the community that were kind of going through this short-term power outage. So all of a sudden you had people, some among the long-term homeless, some who had been homeless for months or certainly weren't going to have access to a house once the power came back on, mixed in with people in their community that was experiencing this kind of short-term outage. And that turned into some pretty interesting conversations. And one thing you would see, and I know, is that when something initially goes wrong, when something changes and it's a difficult thing that you go through, it's a new stressor, it's a big environmental change, like the power going out, you know, our minds, we go through this process of transition and adaptation, and we're initially very stressed until we can figure out how to cope, what to do, who do we know to depend on or to lean on, you know, where to get help from. All of this is sort of like new questions that tend to come to our consciousness, and we feel very challenged by it. And I think that helps the people that are newly going through it to really appreciate, you know, what that must be like for people who have gone through homelessness. But in the back of their minds, they have most of these folks have a support system or know that eventually the power is going to come back on and they're going to go back to their homes. So it's a bit different than someone who's out there longer term and trying to deal with this. And some of the folks who I met who were homeless were kind of feeling like, well, why are these people?
Big deal?
Yeah, why are they, you know, complaining so much about it? I mean, you know, in a few days you're going to have your home, you're going to be warm, you're going to be okay. Now, I'm not saying they were right in thinking that. I'm just saying compared to their experience, that rang true to them, and that's where they were at. But I think as you adapt to a circumstance, it does get easier in certain ways, and it gets harder in other ways. So it's hard to live and not have the hope that pretty soon you're going to have a better situation. You know, it's hard to be homeless for a long period of time, and you hear, well, you're on a list, and when your name finally comes up, you'll get the affordable housing. But you get a letter in the mail, and it literally says something like, the list is going to go on for 10 years. I mean, people wouldn't believe it, but this is what actually happens. They get on subsidized housing lists, and they're told it's a 10-year wait. Now, it may not be true that it's really a 10-year wait, but that is what they get in the mail as an initial letter. So at a certain point, being on a list seems meaningless to a lot of people. You know, when you're homeless, there's a lot of immediacy needs. You know, you need help now. You need to worry about being safe and in shelter now. You need to worry about where you're going to get your next meal, how to make a little bit of money, so on and so forth. You know, clean clothing, where to do your laundry. I went through a little bit of that in those 4.5 days. You know, where am I going to do my laundry? Where am I going to take a shower? And it took me, and I think others, a little while to figure that out. And I felt like just at the point where I was starting to figure that out a little bit, luckily, the power came on. Because even though I would have had it more figured out and been less stressed in the moment on what to do, the prospects of living that way for a long time is just tough.
You know, when you said the power came on, I identified what the meaning of the power came on to mean for me that this community, like many other communities which have taken limited resources and are working with the human resource group in the community to bring about some of the most elemental needs to satisfy dealing with the problem of homelessness, that we're now at a point where we're reaching the point of no return in terms of the inability to cope with the magnitude of the problem that we have today. And we haven't talked about the hundreds of thousands of families so that we have more than one kind of population. But the reality of that challenge today is that when we talk about hundreds of thousands of foreclosures, we're talking about the disruption of families. We're talking about the disruption of communities. We're talking about kids not being able to go to the schools that they were usually going to, health care, not having access to health care, the indices of suicide and mental health breakdowns and heart attacks are directly related to unemployment and homelessness. And so today we can't get away. There isn't a neighborhood in the United States, with very few exceptions, maybe the 1%, that don't see the problem every day in terms of what's going on with their neighbor's kids and their neighbor's family. And I sort of kind of think that we need to bring us back to end on the note that it takes not only a village to raise a child, but it takes a community and a nation to face the problems of homelessness and the unemployed. And I'm really pleased with the work you're doing as another social worker, because I think it's an important contribution. But it also stands out for me as an opportunity to say, unless we begin to become more aware of what's happening to those who are losing their homes, who are homeless, then our society is in a destructive stance. And I think just as we lost power for days and we realized that we were in danger, that something bad was happening, and when was the electricity going to go on? We need to understand that the rising unemployment and homelessness is another warning to our society. So, Jay, thanks for coming and sharing your experiences with the rest of the community. Well, I think that's about it for this week. I'll sum up by saying that we're going to have guests over the next few weeks, and we will also have an opportunity to bring some folks from Occupation Wall Street who are looking at the relationship between Main Street and Wall Street in terms of the problems of our economy, our quality of life, the American dream, which is under direct threat today. So good night. See you next week. Thanks to the ACTV student volunteers and staff for making this possible, and look forward to seeing you in future weeks. Good night.
Thank you.